So we talked about training and
Mhm.
kind of the regimen of high school for us. And then you had mentioned that your college coaches had like a better background. You probably had a separate strength and conditioning coach.
Mhm.
Um, would you mind kind of elaborating on both football and wrestling and your lifting and exercise progression there?
Yeah. So as soon as I committed to playing football there, they sent out a strength and conditioning packet to everybody for the summer. And that packet was probably about this thick here. And it contained a lifting plan, a cardio plan, agility training plan, and it broke down everything piece by piece. Your weights are going to start at this at like here, you're going to work your way up to this percentage and then go back down. You're going to run this many drills today in this formation that had like the cone drills and everything. And then so the summer plan, it was pretty regimented. And then once we actually got there, you would have, once practice started, it scaled back to where we'd be lifting 2 to 3 times a week. You'd come in the morning before your classes, get a lift in, and then you'd be back later in the day for practice. Um, wrestling was wrestling. The conditioning was a lot more like on the mat. We actually had a little weight room in the wrestling room there, so like we'd
Oh,
have a
wow.
practice. So, we'd have practice, and then at the end of it, we'd do like a conditioning circuit with like a lighter weight, but still enough to like get the burn going. But that would be paired with more like traditional like cardio, like sprints. We had the battle ropes in there, so it was definitely uh, you could definitely tell it was more like kind of powerlifting focused with the football program, because you had more your basic squats, deadlifts, you throw a few power cleans in there maybe. And then with the wrestling, it definitely was more of like a more hybrid kind of, wrestling's a combat sport, so it's one of those things where you have to be at least somewhat competent at everything. So the training had to kind of match that. And same thing with the schedule was lift in the morning, practice in the evening. So it was a lot to handle at once, but it was structured properly to where I felt like I could do it.
Yeah. And whenever you say like you had to be able to handle everything with wrestling, uh, was it more like you had to be strong in all these different positions rather than just the few select positions of maybe football?
Yeah, exactly. You had to be strong in all these different positions. And then the one thing they really wanted to drill home with wrestling is you had to be able to produce force power even when your cardio is gassed, when you're dog tired.
Mhm.
At the end of a match, you still need to be able to explode with maximum force to get a takedown or to secure a position or something like that. So it was a lot of where you'd get your cardio done first, you'd already be gassed, and then you'd go into lifting, explosive power, plyometrics, things like that.
Yeah, so not nearly as much barbell lifts, a little more like calisthenic
Yes,
oriented.
yeah, yes,
Okay,
yes, for sure.
cool. And I do have to ask this because I have my old roommate Jeff on last week, and we talked a little bit about like depth and the controversy of like, do athletes need to squat to depth? And of course, I'm very opinionated on that, but um, were your coaches stringent as far as like hitting proper depth on say a squat, or not so much?
So, by your standards, probably not. But everybody at least got to where their legs were parallel to the ground. So you wouldn't be getting to that deep powerlifting depth, but you were still getting down to that, where your top, where your bottom, so your legs are hitting 90 degrees. So at least in that aspect, it was pretty consistent. The standard was consistent. It may just not be as strict as you would find in a powerlifting or other kind of weightlifting scenario like that.
Gotcha. But you were closely monitored at least to have everyone to that standard.
Yeah, it wasn't like high school where it was just like, all right, you're going to go down and up, get in there, and then you'd have
Yeah.
kids on like doing one of those numbers.
Yeah, my favorite, and not to rag on the old football coaches too much, Okay, shout out to my dad. He was the head football coach. So, like, and this wasn't him. I'm not talking about him, but I I specifically remember there's like a they would do this thing whenever we maxed out where they'd just yell up whenever you got to depth or whatever. But the problem with that system is uh, when the coach is emotionally invested in the lifter or the player getting it, and they want the player to succeed more than they want proper technique, it would just be like squats would get higher and higher, and you get higher and higher up commands as the weight went up. And I just remember being like, no. So, um, thinking about what you were saying, maybe higher than what I would consider like a proper squat depth. But I think as long as you're keeping the training consistent, like you said with your coaches, then that probably paid off just as well if you could linearly progress through that.
For sure. And like with like sport specific training like that, it's especially with football, it's not very often you're going to find yourself in that deep squat position. You are kind of more in a partial squat starting out, so sometimes it's kind of it translates better in that regard.
Yeah, that was because Jeff also he coaches college football as well, and I think he gets that side. And usually that's the argument that you get from strength coaches. My opposing view that I'll push back a little bit with that is, and it was because it happened to me.
Mhm.
So like in high school, I was squatting high. Um, I would probably call it egregiously high, but it was probably like hamstring 90 degrees kind of. Um, but whenever I got to the season, I got folded up and pulled a hamstring. It was a mild tear, but bringing it back around, yes, a football player is not going to start in those positions, but like in case you're forced into a position like that, wouldn't you rather have the musculature that's used to being strong in that deep squat position? And I know there's no right or wrong answer because there's just as many people who will, would argue that. But I would just say, let's get strong deeper, and then like you're going to have to use less weight, but you'll still be strong. But yeah, I think that's a valid argument as well to say, hey, a football player is not having the squat to powerlifting depth.
It definitely can help with injury prevention, like you said, in that situation for sure. And it has like in jiu-jitsu, like I do now, it's definitely a lot better to, squat to full depth because, there's times where, you may not be squatting down like you would in a lift, but, there's times where your legs will get pushed over your head, into that deep position where, someone's attacking you from the top. So you'll be in that position anyway. And it helps to have that strength there to know you're not going to get injured, but B, to have, if you have good strength there, you can, fight off that person better from those, more end ranges of motion that you wouldn't commonly find.
Yeah, and hey, you just gave a perfect example of like that sport specific strength. I just gave the like argument, oh, a football player should squat a little deeper than hamstrings to 90 degrees.
Mhm.
But you could turn it around on me, like if I started jujitsu and say, well, maybe you should be squatting ass to grass, all the way down. Because if your leg's getting forced above your head, I'll tell you what, my hamstring is coming off if my leg has to go over my head. So, yeah. Even like I would say I squat relatively deep, but I don't squat that deep.
No, you definitely get all the way down there sometimes for sure in jiu-jitsu. It's a very flexibility lends itself well to that sport for sure, which is something
Yeah.
that coming from this powerlifting background, I do not have in spades. So that's been something I've had to adjust to since I started.
Yeah, that's a good point. You've got the strength, but the flexibility might be a little bit lacking. Do you stretch, or how have you approached that?
Yeah, so I do probably 10 to 15 minutes of stretching a day, just working through, deep squats, internal, external hip rotation. Same thing with my shoulders, trying to internally and externally rotate them, to get them into better positions because my shoulders are pretty tight still from powerlifting. My hip mobility has gotten a lot better, but I've just same thing with lifting, just staying consistent with it, trying to progress. How deep I can hit the stretches at times has been helpful, and just approaching it like that way, still kind of giving it that like same structured mentality you would as you're training as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a solid way to go about it.